I'm Hamish Black, and this is Writing on Games. And so, the onward march of the not simulators continues. Jim Sterling posted a video from his Best of Steam Greenlight series recently, featuring a trailer for Gamer Simulator, in which the player takes on the role of a quote-unquote gamer from a first-person perspective, playing terrible knockoffs of other games like Fez, for example. In this video, Jim states that if the sole joke and all that that joke contains can be explained away in one screenshot, you probably don't have enough for a game. This statement got me thinking about the state of simulator games in a post-Goat Simulator world. Simulator games, to me anyway, have always been incredibly fun to break. With that in mind, I thoroughly enjoyed Goat Simulator when many others in the medium dismissed it as mere pewdie bait or YouTube fodder. With this episode of Writing on Games then, I want to try and break down why I maintain that these people are wrong about Goat Simulator in particular, attempting to break down why badly made simulator games can be so fun, why the glut of so-called simulator games post-Goat Simulator have been so damn unfunny, and why Goat Simulator should be considered as separate from these. So hold on to your hats everyone, it's gonna be a bumpy, poorly constructed, screen-tearing, texture-clipping ride. So to begin, just what are simulator games, and why are they so fun to break? To be honest, the name is fairly self-explanatory, but the games themselves often are not. The format usually takes the form of insert real-world activity here simulator, and the games themselves attempt to present a facsimile of what it would actually be like to partake in these activities. The most successful examples of this, both commercially and arguably mechanically, are games like Flight Simulator and Train Simulator, which often have yearly expansions and possess fans to spend upwards of thousands of pounds on DLC. Essentially, in Train Simulator's case for instance, this is the virtual equivalent of a model railway, and it inspires the same kind of rabid enthusiasm as its real-world counterpart from its niche but ardent fanbase. At their best, they offer almost one-to-one levels of realism and complexity, to the point where some would say that with games like DCS World, they could potentially use it as a training simulator for the real thing. What happens then when this level of complexity is dumbed down to its lowest level and poorly made in an attempt to cash in on a game that requires arguably less work? Games like Warehouse and Logistics Simulator, Ski Resort Simulator, and Airport Simulator are incredibly dumbed down, borderline broken games that at best barely represent the activity they are attempting to simulate, and at worst are nigh unplayable. Why then do I still find these games fun to play? It's certainly not a genuine enjoyment from the intended gameplay, as it's often incredibly boring to carry out the tasks these games actually ask of you. No, I would argue that there exists a kind of metagame with these simulators, in which it becomes infinitely more compelling to see how badly one can break these games. I would assert that this is not merely a personal preference, as exemplified by the thousands of comedy videos on YouTube from people like NerdCubed and PewDiePie, illustrating how poor these games are, and the millions of views many of these videos garner. How can this phenomenon be explained then? I mean, simply put, there exists a joy in absurdity, and these games present that by the bucket load. Even with the more competent games, in fact, I would argue, especially with the competent games, there is a sense that you are presented with these real-world situations without the consequence of any action committed in this world. You want to take a 747 and do loop-the-loops before spiralling into the ground? Go for it. You want to make a train go as fast as possible before releasing every carriage and going out in a blaze of glory? You can do that. You want to see how many sick flips your tractor can do when you launch it off the pavement? Absolutely. Even in the less competent games, the uncanny valley aspect of seeing how these games differentiate from the real world can often create comedy. Like when you drive on a pavement and find that not only do pedestrians not seem to notice or care, you merely drive through them as if they weren't there to begin with. These glitches are absurd because the games attempt to present themselves as close representations of real-life activities, but then come across as unsettling in the ways in which the reality of the gameplay fails to line up with this idea. However, in 2014, a game was announced that would change the way people view simulators forever, for better or worse. That game was Goat Simulator, and it caused a considerable stir within the gaming community and divided opinion like no other game released that year. For those who don't know, Goat Simulator has the player take on the role of, surprise surprise, a goat. The idea is that the game was deliberately designed so that the developer would not fix the majority of bugs. As such, the game is littered with visual glitches, and as a result, hilarity obviously ensues. That said, we must take into account Jim Sterling's quote: "If the sole joke can be explained away in one screenshot, you probably don't have enough for a game." So, if Goat Simulator's sole joke is so simplistic, why did it make the impact it did? And make an impact it certainly did. A YouTube search reveals hundreds of thousands of videos, many with well over 1 million views. This is down to a number of reasons, and the most notable one perhaps is that people just like that joke. It's hard to deny that the vast majority of people will take things on face value, and the novelty of seeing a goat do things that a goat cannot and will not do, no matter how hard I try otherwise, is perhaps enough for them to get laughs out of. I would argue, however, that the game goes far deeper than that. It ended up as one of my favourite games of last year. For one, I would argue that Goat Simulator acts as an inversion of the typical simulator formula. Whilst most simulators provide you with a fairly mundane activity that the player then bends and breaks until they make their own fun with it, as it were, Goat Simulator goes another way. Arguably, the simplicity of Goat Simulator's sole joke is the way in which it skips the notion of having the player bend and break the rules of the world. The world is already fundamentally broken. With this in mind, the developers are actually able to turn their focus elsewhere, on creating a mechanically satisfying and surprisingly deep experience. The glitches, for the most part, are purely visual. Apart from an achievement which dares the player to try and break the game, there are very few situations in which it is possible to actually break the experience on anything more than a superficial level. This means that the player's focus turns to exploring the world. The situation provided to the player is not mundane as it might be in other simulators, and so the developer takes advantage of this by filling the area with different activities and secrets. The mechanics of traversal are actually fairly satisfying in this case, and the scoring or quest log element of the game gives the player something to aim for, often using the absurdity of the mechanics or physics in order to achieve them. For example, you might need the goat to fly a particular distance that seems at first unattainable, until you realise that you can headbutt a tanker and have it explode, sending the goat soaring uncontrollably. It's a simple example, but it's one of many ways in which the faux broken nature of the game actually becomes mechanically advantageous to the player. The visual gags are also backed up with some incredibly well executed and often meta humour, like when you can actually visit the development studio that make the game, or when you approach any TV and get to play a game of Flappy Goat, or when you realise that you can become a devil goat which allows you to summon goat sacrifices in a satanic ritual which strengthens your powers. What I'm arguing here is that there's so much more to Goat Simulator than many of its critics give it credit for. To say that, oh, it's a game with a goat doing not goat things, haha, funny random blah, is reductive, as this is pure novelty, and once this wears off, there exists an interesting, uncanny, funny world to explore, with surprisingly clever mechanics. If you haven't tried it yet, even if you're cynical of the whole thing, I'd encourage you to check it out. It's a pretty fun and interesting experience for starting a genre that is so lamentable today. Why then are these so-called simulator games being released post-Goat Simulator such catastrophic failures? Well, to quote Glenn Beckett, one is always willfully absurd. If one does not say silly things with a purpose, then he is merely an idiot. Goat Simulator, as previously argued, has a purpose with its silliness. Its silliness acts as a smokescreen of sorts, taking the player out of the typical simulator breaking experience and exposing them to a game which is funny and interesting in its own right. When we consider then games like Rock Simulator or Grass Simulator, what purpose do these serve? These games are truly one note, neither do they offer the lack of self-awareness that makes breaking these games fun. I mean, in the same sense that The Room in Tommy Wiseau's mind was originally a heart-wrenching love story. Nor do they offer the interesting worlds, narratives, or gameplay of something like Goat Simulator. They exist simply to make one joke, which is explained in the title. They exist almost entirely for the purpose of having YouTubers like PewDiePie make videos on them. But as a result, they end up looking like they're trying way too hard. This has resulted in a glut of so-called simulator games being released on Steam and the Android store that are just nothing. Literally just placing the player in a barren world and telling them, this is funny. This, arguably, is not good enough. This is where the novelty truly does last as long as it takes to look at a screenshot, and as such, longevity isn't even a factor of discussion here. As I say, a good simulator game is one that either the developers can make interesting from a gameplay perspective, or one that the developer isn't aware is bad. As with any auteur in any creative media, if a developer truly believes that they are making something great and it turns out to be barely competent, there's arguably art within that. That, to me, is why breaking simulator games is so fun. The idea that I, as a player, am causing havoc in a world that was never intended to accommodate it gives a feeling of power and rebellion that, in all seriousness, few games can match. What is best, however, is when a game can provide that rebellious experience and yet can also function as a competent and even fun game. I'm looking at you, Euro Truck Simulator 2, with your zen-like motorways and barely recognisable cities, and looking at it, I just can't help but be relaxed. Sorry about that. I'm Hamish Black, and this has been Writing on Games. I'll see you next time.